Welcome, my friends. Welcome to our little show.
Holotank version 101.12.001C initializing. Hardware online. Initializing emitter array. Loading interface protocols. Initializing ghost protocols. Configuring logic array. Loading memory resources. Interface protocols online. Initializing avatar. Holotank visual projectors online. Holotank active.
Name omitted is not available, so I will be handling this video. You will be listening to The Valley of Bones, a fairy tale from the Crooked Path collection. Observation: this might not be a proper fairy tale.
The Valley of Bones. Once upon a time a tale was told of a valley, far to the west, far beyond the borders of the nearest kingdom in lands that were claimed by no man. But this was no ordinary valley nestled amidst the green and rolling hills or verdant but wild and untamed forest, though, to be sure, the tales agreed, such terrain surrounded it. For however green the land might be, the valley itself was bare and rocky, and those few travelers who encountered the place and returned to relate the tale told of sheer and bare rocky walls that plunged sharply down to a floor not of rocks but of countless bones, and the valley was therefore named in these tales the Valley of Bones. No one knew why this should be or what mysterious agency had been at work in this desolate place, though innumerable tales speculated upon everything from dragons and murderous rodents to the place being a lost graveyard of mighty beasts. No one knew, and none were brave enough to venture intentionally to the place to find out. For those who had actually seen the Valley of Bones with their own eyes, none could say that he had ventured down into that grim and shadowed space between the steep and bare cliff walls. There were, quite naturally, many who claimed, upon the contrary, that the valley was but a story, a tale told and retold around campfires to frighten the gullible and superstitious, the teller secure in the knowledge that since the valley did not actually exist, there could be none to claim that they had reached the spot and disproved it. Indeed, even those who had glimpsed the terrifying place from afar were not entirely sure where it lay exactly, for the land was wild and pathless and navigation in that region far from certain. But however the belief and doubt might run, it was not a journey to be taken lightly, for the lands were wild and treacherous, and while many might profess to believe or deny, it was rare indeed to find in any one person the combination of skill, ability, and inclination to go and have a look. And so it remained, the legendary Valley of Bones, far off to the west in the midst of the wild and unpeopled lands. And so would the legendary Valley of Bones have passed into legend in truth, but every now and then some new tale would spread, of some adventurer or traveler in the wilds who had glimpsed from afar the sheer and rocky cliffs, and who knew at once where they were, and made haste the way back that they had come. And some who were braver drew near the rocky precipice of one or the other of the sheer and bitter walls, and glimpsed down into the shadowy depths and might see, far below, the pale whites and yellows set, as it were, amidst the dark and complex shadows, and know the shapes below for what they were. And there may have been those who were yet braver, who descended into the valley and walked upon that terrible and mortal carpet. But if there were, no such tale they returned to tell. Now for generations these stories were told and retold, but in truth they varied not at all, save in what happenstance had led the traveler or adventurer to stumble upon the place, and this added a certain weight to the tales. Therefore, when the kingdoms expanded into the unexplored wilderness and the world was diminished, it seemed to many that the valley was not so remote. And so in the course of time it came into the mind of the king of one such kingdom that he would see the terrible place of legend for himself, and perhaps even claim the valley for himself and his people, since it seemed likely that none would dare contest the claim. Thus it was that the king with his guard and many knights besides set off into the west to seek out the Valley of Bones and perhaps to make it into an outpost of his kingdom, and perhaps further, to claim any treasures that might therein lie for his own treasury. They journeyed many days into the west until they came to the very border of the kingdom, and still they journeyed on until at last the road ended in a small and decaying town. There was no lord nor mayor, but there was an inn, far too poor and small for such regal patrons, for though soiled with the dust and dirt of many miles, the king was yet dressed in his royal finery, and the weapons and armor of the king's men gleamed in the shafts of sunlight that filtered down through the trees. Though the place was far too small and humble a place for any of the royal company to pass the night in comfort, the king, accompanied by the captain of his guard, nevertheless went inside to ask the innkeeper of the country thereabouts and of the location of the closest road heading west. "There be no road to the west," the huge and unkempt man insisted as he wiped a filthy wooden mug with an equally dirty cloth. "Can ye not see? There be nothing to that way but trees, and you'd be best heading back." "Then where can we find a guide?" asked the captain of the guard. "There be no guides," replied the man, "least none that would take ye into the forest." "Well, do you have any spare horses?" the captain asked again, as if checking items off a list. And in truth he was, for he had seen that the inn's tiny stable was empty. "Can ye not see?" replied the innkeeper. "I haven't any horses. I suppose you'll have to walk." "We have our own horses," said the captain, "but they are tired, and we would prefer not to rest them in this miserable place if that might be avoided, for we yet have a long journey ahead of us." "And where be ye off to, then?" the innkeeper asked suspiciously. "There be nothing to the west but trees, trees without end and without road or town. Ye'll not find any castle, nay, even any ruins." But the king, fearing the search might be long and that news might, even from this desolate and remote location, come to the ears of another kingdom's ruler before the valley could be found and claimed, raised a hand to stop the captain from replying. Though the unpleasant innkeeper's information had in truth been of very little value, the king compensated him for it anyway with a handful of copper and silver coins, which, though also of little value, constituted a veritable fortune in such a remote place. Once the horses and men were rested, they continued on, though in truth it might be better if they had left the horses behind and walked. The ground was hard and uneven beneath the slippery carpet of leaves, and at times the undergrowth was so thick that the men, already dismounted and leading their horses instead of riding, were obliged to cut and hack their way through them, and both the edges and the shine of their fine swords and lances grew dull from use. As the journey wore on, occasionally a horse would step on some uneven stone or into some pit hidden by the treacherous leaves, or simply slip as the slippery carpet shifted beneath the beast's hooves on some hill or incline, and be left lame and unrideable, or else break a leg and have to be killed, and the gear it carried be distributed among the men and the remaining animals. It was no terrain for either horse or man, and many times the king wondered if perhaps he had been too hasty, if it might not have been better to send engineers and laborers to build a road into the wilderness, and with them to send scouts rather than to quest for the fabled place himself. And in truth, even this more cautious approach would have brought no guarantee of success, for there was no map and, to the west, hardly constituted precise directions. But it was now too late to change his mind, for surely by now word would have spread of his intent, however secret the preparations had been. And surely there would be others, rivals, who would want the valley for their own, not for any value it might represent, but simply to deny it to him. So on they journeyed in the pathless and treacherous wilderness, always heading west towards the distant mountains, for there it seemed that valleys as deep and sheer as in the tales would most likely be found. As they journeyed, the forest and the ground upon which it grew became ever more treacherous, and though they still journeyed west, they were gradually forced to the north. At last, on the third week, they came to a place where the trees were too close, the thorny briars too tangled, and the horses too starved to continue. In truth, there were few horses left, and those that remained of too little use on the terrain, so 2 of the knights were tasked with taking the horses in such gear as they might back to the small and nameless town, should that prove possible. For the king and the rest of his men, however, they continued on foot, for the mountains were now visibly closer, and glimpses might be seen, here and there between gaps in the foliage, of rocky slopes or snowy peaks looming up out of the west. But even without the horses, it soon became apparent that the forest did not wish them to continue west towards the mountains, and ever conspired to force them towards the north. The terrain grew ever more broken, though occasional glimpses told them they no longer seemed to be nearing those distant peaks. Undergrowth grew ever more thorny and dense, and tore at their now ragged clothes should they try and force their way through it. The king himself, who had long since had to trade his royal finery for more sensible wooden clothes, became convinced that the land itself conspired against them, and ever they strove to return to the westward course, to find some detour or roundabout route that would allow them to continue forward. Ever as they found a narrow path, they would find it blocked after but a few paces, or there would be a cliff or an impenetrable wall of bramble stretching into the distance. At night, around the fires that threw long and wavering shadows into the black and silent woods, they would sit in silence and partake of their dwindling rations. More often than not, the captain of the guard would speak, or the king, and bid the men to keep heart, for the end of the journey was surely at hand, and all would sleep a little more soundly as might be in that strange and dark place. For long since had they noticed that the forest was silent, both by day and by night, and though there was much food to be found with little foraging, thus had they survived for many weeks, there were no living things apart from plants. No squirrels raced from limb to limb above them, no birds sang to greet the rising sun or glided high above through the branches, no track of hart nor howl of wolf might be seen or heard. Though by now all were aware of this, none, not even the king, could rightly say how long it had been true. No one could remember when last he had seen an animal or bird, or even an insect, and each man, to greater or lesser extent, grew uneasy, especially at night. Yet the silent darkness of the depths of the forest would seem to go on forever, and which each man might swear was seeking to impede their quest, never held any danger, and each cold and grey dawn brought only mists that drifted harmlessly through the trees about their campsite like wayward ghosts, chilly but impotent. Each morning they would arise, stoke the fire and eat of their dwindling rations, or more often of what fruits and nuts they could gather about the camp, for both were plentiful. Most often in silence this was, as deep as the silence of the forest itself, and then they would continue, ever seeking a passage through the forest into the west. One day, as the sun began its descent from the sky, they came upon what seemed to be the forest's edge. And so sudden was this that it seemed to them one moment that the forest went on forever, and the next that it continued no more, and peering out of the open space beyond the trees, the king felt despair. It seemed to him that they had been forced to travel so far north that they had come out of the forest far from the valley, on the fields bordering the edge of some distant kingdom, and that he and his travel-worn men must now beg for shelter and the leave of some other monarch to return home through the strange lands. Thus, knowing the quest failed, he hung his head and walked forward. As the trees ended, however, he beheld with amazement and horror the fabled valley spread out below him exactly as the tales had claimed, between two sheer and bitter precipices that plummeted to shadowy depths filled with bones uncounted, as far upon either side as the eye might see. Yet towards the west it seemed that the ground sloped gradually downward. The king and all of his men stood there, frozen by the awe and horror of the terrible valley's presence. For here too it was silent, except for the rustling of leaves in the trees, and nothing moved except for the waving branches, and from far below the distant rushing and bubbling of a rill that meandered through and over the innumerable remains below. It was a terrible sight, and the horror of it stole the king's breath away. Yet it was not a fearsome sight, and there was no feel of either evil or menace about the place. Long they stood there, staring down into the depths, and there they camped for that night, near and yet far enough from the precipice that none might step over the cliff unawares. And yet the camp that night was as still and silent as any previous night, and not even the king or the captain spoke to break the heavy silence, while the fire crackled and the shadows danced, dark and grotesque, into the depths of the forest behind them. For the silence was like a weight that each man might lift if he tried, yet did not for the wearisomeness of the task. In the morning, though he could not bring himself to speak the words, the king determined to go down slope along the valley's rim, once again towards the west, and so to enter the valley itself from its mouth on the plain below. For though they had not seen it themselves, that is how the tales described the terrain, and then make their way through the valley itself towards whatever might await them, be it danger or treasure, or merely walls of stone.
Recording damage detected. Attempting to compensate, but I think this audio will need to be recorded again.
This time the forest did not hinder them, and they made swift progress, the walls of the valley growing both closer together and less tall and sheer, and after a time they found they could bring themselves to whisper, though to a man they yet felt uncomfortable and fearful to raise their voices, though none could rightly say why. The king and his captain were much pleased with the terrain, for it seemed ideal for a secluded stronghold, with abundant food, though no animals, about in fresh water, and all in the midst of unclaimed land, and the soldiers and guards marveled at the vast quantity of bones, and to them it seemed clear that in such a place there must be treasure of some sort. There was no way that whether the bones be of beasts or men, so many could have died in such a remote place, and therefore the bones that must have been brought there for some purpose. And then the men were silent again as one of their number pondered aloud upon what purpose it might have been. So journeying, they camped for 2 more nights, and each day the land continued to fall, and as they went farther west the bones carpeting the valley grew closer, but no thinner. Even the king and his captain ceased speaking in whispers of plans to fortify the valley in the face of the impossible quantity of remains below. Finally, on the morning of the 3rd day, the trees began to thin and the plain below came into sight. There was no sign of the mountain they had glimpsed through the trees, and the captain suggested that perhaps their direction had not been so certain as they had presumed, but it mattered not, for finally they stood between the valley walls with the cold stream lapping at their tired feet. Finally the carpet of bones had ended, and there was but soil and rock beneath the wide and steep walls, though the valley floor was strewn with boulders and overgrown with scrubby trees and grasses. Here, finally, the captain of the guard first, and then the others began to feel a sense of foreboding. They had long since grown accustomed to the silence, but now there was the sense of the world holding its breath, not so much in anticipation as lest it be heard. Then the captain, in urgent whispers, recounted to the king the tales of this place, and how no matter how many people glimpsed the valley from afar or below, that no tale told of anyone who had ventured further inside than where they now stood. Though uneasy himself, the king replied that no one had been brave enough to venture inside, and that they would be the first. And how do we know that none had ventured inside? Might it be that many did, and that of them none returned to spread the tale? Though the king dismissed the captain's fears, he nevertheless conceded that a few men should be sent in as scouts. But not far, the king insisted, lest his trusted men find some manner of treasure, and spirited away to a hiding place unobserved that they might later recover it. And then return to us and tell me what you see. Though the captain expected for some reason he could not put into words that his men would not return, after but a few hours they were spotted, appearing from behind one of the many jagged boulders some distance into the valley. We did not go far as you ordered, one of the men reported. We went far enough to see where the bones began, but no further. There was nothing to see but plants and rocks, no animals, and no signs of anything living. And what did you make of the bones? To what manner of man or beast do they belong? Asked the king. Many are the bones of men, and many are of beast and bird, the man replied. And yet many more we do not know. Some must have been of great beasts indeed, for we have never seen the like, nor the like of any beast so large. It is as if the bones of all that lived in the land and the land about were gathered here, but of why or how there is no sign. There was no sign that any living thing has walked or flown here. Though the water is sweet and clear, there is nothing that swims in it. You drank the water? The captain exclaimed in horror. But in truth he knew that they all must, bones or no, or else immediately depart. For they had little water left and had found none for several days. I did, the man replied. My throat was parched, and I had none else. And though the bones are endless beyond count, there is no decay to taint the water that we saw, either as we looked or below as we walked along the valley these past few days. These bones are old, some such that they turn to powder underfoot, or even crumble at the touch. The water is clean. Hearing this, the king was heartened, though none could imagine from where such a vast quantity of bones of so many creatures might have come. But the captain was filled all the more with doubt, and he again urged the king to send but part of the men into the valley to explore, and to determine if there be any danger as yet undetected, for as of yet they still knew nothing more than the tales might tell them. The king was unwilling that his men should go where he stayed behind.
Audio damage repaired. Normal audio quality restored.
Perhaps, sire, the captain insisted, we should leave part of the men here and travel back along the valley's rim to its end. And in doing so, perhaps we shall not only see more, but if there really be danger we can observe it and yet remain unobserved ourselves. And if you wish to raise a stronghold here, the whole of the valley must be surveyed from above. We are here, sire, the captain continued. No one has beaten us to this place. There is plenty of food, as yet no danger, and sweet water besides. Where is the harm in a little caution that may save us time later? But the king, overcome with impatience and fascination with the terrible valley that he now thought of as his own, became angry and would have none of it. "I will not suffer delay," he replied to the captain angrily. "We did not come all the way to delay, nor will I suffer to be kept waiting while others explore this new realm that I claim in my own name before me. If your heart be not bold enough to accompany me, you shall then remain here in shame while your king leads his men. In fact, I so order it, and your men shall stay with you, for I have no need of cowards by my side. Perhaps when I return my anger will be cooled, and we shall speak together of what treasures or wonders may be found, but of the finding you shall have no part. Now be gone from my sight." And the king turned away along with his knights and began to move into the valley, along the edge of the cool, swiftly flowing stream. But the captain of the guard was no coward nor lacking in honor. Though his heart misgave him to do so, he and his men would gladly have accompanied the king and his horseless knights into the valley, all the more so since he feared some danger as yet unrevealed, even into certain death if that was the king's chosen path. But he could not now disobey the will of the king, and so he and his men of the royal guard remained behind. But he would not suffer to be left idle any more than would the king himself, and so he sent 6 men, 3 upon each side of the valley, to both survey the land and to watch for danger lest the king and his knights be surprised or assailed at unawares. And then he waited with the remaining men for the king and his scouts to return. For 7 days they waited, and the king did not return. Finally, one group of scouts upon the northern rim returned with tidings. "We followed the king and his knights as you ordered for 1 day, then 2. But on the 3rd night we saw their fire below us, and rose before dawn. When the sun rose there was no sign of them. Thinking they must have arisen early and outpaced us in their haste, we continued with all speed, and across the valley we saw the other group do the same. But though we made haste, we never again caught a glimpse of them, nor any sign of their passage below. As we reached the point where the walls became more steep and the floor below grew ever deeper and shadowed as they drew closer together, we and the other scouts both stopped, and they made sign for us to go back in case we had somehow passed them in the night, but that they should continue on along the valley's rim. That was 3 days ago, and we have returned with all possible haste, but we saw no sign of the king or his company." Though deeply concerned, the captain did not venture into the valley in search of the king. But he would not disobey his king, and moreover felt certain that some formless evil had come upon his lord in the night, and he would not risk his men. And though he did not think it so, it might even be that the king in his haste had outpaced the 6 guards, and both the remaining 3 guards and the king's party would return soon. For 3 more days he waited, and then, finally, his remaining 3 men returned. Their leader, his lieutenant, related much the same story until the point where the 2 groups had gone their separate ways. The lieutenant had directed the other party to turn back in case, in their zeal, they had outpaced the king's party, or perhaps the king's party itself had turned back for some unknown reason of the night. The captain did not think this likely, but was not displeased with his lieutenant's caution. "We continued on," the lieutenant continued, "and for 3 days saw nothing but bones below while the valley grew ever deeper and darker and more narrow. And then we came to a place much like we often encountered in the forest, where we could not press forward, and we sought to detour around it. But the woods would have none of that, and by the time we worked our way around it, I guess, the valley walls had come together. I wished to make sure and to return along the opposite precipice, but we could find no way forward, and I was at last forced to return the way we had come. We saw no sign of the king, and I do not believe we could have been outdistanced or outpaced." Hearing this, the captain was deeply troubled, and he decided that he must disobey the king's orders. He feared his lord's wrath should his fears be somehow unfounded, but dreaded that some evil had befallen the king and his knights even more, and thus he determined that he and his men would go to the king's aid, or die trying, if that be their doom. He sent the same 6 men to travel as before, and always within sight of both himself and each other, and then he and the rest of his company entered into the valley, and the sheer stone walls began to rise upon either side. After a few hours the bones began to be visible underfoot, and before long the ground was treacherous and footing unsure, for bones would snap or crumble or twist unexpectedly underfoot. Thus was the track of the king's party in front of them plain and clear. But as the sun drew on towards midday, a shout from the 3 men upon the left edge of the valley brought the captain and his company to a halt. Looking up at the men high above, he could see one of them pointing towards the valley floor some distance ahead. When he and 2 others went to investigate, fearing an enemy or ambush, they found neither. For there, lying half buried, was the plain golden circlet that the king wore when traveling in place of his formal crown of office. With a shout, the captain called the rest of the men forward, and they spent the next hour searching, digging through the grisly rubble that was all that remained of countless men and beasts, and at the end of it found 2 swords, one belonging to a knight of the king, and the other of an ancient and thoroughly unfamiliar design, a waterskin, and a shirt of still bright mail. There was nothing else but bones in the swiftly running stream, but once the bones had carpeted the valley floor there was still the occasional boulder, but no longer were there any plants. Looking ahead, the captain saw the valley continue straight on, growing ever darker as it did so until it ended in a line, as it seemed to him, of impenetrable darkness in the distance. He and his men stood there in silence, staring deeper into the valley. But there was no movement, no sound save that of running water as the sun began to sink in the sky. The captain felt a shiver run down his spine and knew that he dared go no further, nor could he ask it of his men. And yet, it was just a valley. Bones or no, they saw nothing and heard nothing. Finally, he turned without a word back towards the valley's mouth and the plain beyond, and nearly as one his men turned to follow. They made all speed back to their campsite, and all the while neither saw nor heard anything. By the time they reached the bare ground, they were nearly running and continued to do so until one of the men tripped on a stone and had to be helped the rest of the way, for though he now feared to remain, he would not suffer any of his men to be left behind. And indeed, he thought that none had been left behind, though when they stumbled back into camp and were rejoined by the 6 scouts, one was found to be missing. No one knew where or when the man had disappeared or what had become of him, for it did not seem possible, and the captain was sure that none had been left behind. Nevertheless, he would not allow any of his men to re-enter the valley, even had he been able to find one who was willing. Though all were eager to be away, they remained in camp there for 3 more days, then 7. But finally, when neither the king and his knights nor his missing man returned, the captain and his men departed, bearing the orphaned swords and the king's circlet back to the kingdom along with sad tidings. The journey took many months, for the land was stubborn and seemed to resist their efforts to leave, but food and water were plentiful, and through effort and will they were able to make their way steadily east, though each day's march seemed more tiring than the last. Finally, all at once the forest seemed to give up and hinder them no more, and after much hard travel they found their way into forested regions where birds sang and squirrels rushed along the branches overhead. At night wolves howled at the moon, and there were tracks of many creatures both large and small to be seen by day. Though they sorely missed their horses, the survivors of the king expeditions came at last to the small town in the forest, the last outpost of civilization that they had passed months before. As they came out of the woods and into the clearing around the shabby wooden buildings, they saw many fine horses and men with shining mail and swords and lances that glittered in the sun, bearing standards the captain did not know. Outside the inn, 2 particularly fine horses, one white and the other gray, were tethered. Motioning for his men to remain as they were, the captain entered the dilapidated building. The innkeeper was much as he'd remembered, but the 2 men standing in front of the bar, being very careful not to touch anything they didn't have to lest the filth rub off on their fine clothes and splendid armor, were strangers, most likely from one of the neighboring kingdoms his king had once feared would become aware of his intentions towards the valley. All 3 men looked at him in surprise, but before any could respond he addressed the finely dressed man, obviously a king or at least a prince. "Do not seek the valley, for if you do you will find only sorrow and death." The king, for king he no doubt was unused to being spoken to so directly by a lowly man-at-arms, especially one so dirty from the trials of the road. In truth, the captain knew he was not showing this foreign king the dignity due his station, but was too weary and too full of sorrow for the loss of his own lord to do otherwise, and he was lucky that the king merely replied with words, however harsh. "Do not presume to advise us, guard," the foreign king sneered. "We know not of what you speak, nor care. But if we did, we would say to you, were you worth the reply, that we do as we will, and if it is our will to take that what is not owned, we shall do so. If you dare to address us again, we shall have your tongue removed." The captain bowed to the king, and then turned to leave. There was nothing else to do. Rejoining his men, they continued their long, weary journey home. The end.
This is the end of the story. Observation: your compliance is required. You will click the like button. You will subscribe to this video and you will share it with your friends. In the event that you do not, I have been instructed to deactivate your cellular device's notifications and alarms. Thank you. Also, Alexa, please execute General Order 66.